This evening. Um, so I am sharing, or I will in a moment share with you some slides, and I hope that you can get my thoughts for a while, and then we can have a conversation. I think, I guess to begin with, the sort of thinking about the present and thinking about the 2024 election and really thinking about the election season in the face of the sort of politics that we've lived through. I mean, on one level, it's a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a moving target in as much as, our conceptions of political alignments shift and we can talk about in the Q&A session, my friend and colleague Nick Stephanopoulos, has issued this provocative article from maybe a year ago, and it brought up some debates about um the meaning of voter suppression as the demographics and the politics of the United States shift and change. But I don't want, however, and I often tell my students, like, not to get too caught up in the present. And if there is a running theme in my scholarly methodology, it's one of starting with the past and then working to the present day. My instincts think, what are the big themes that we can think about? And one that I've been working on, and Sid alluded to in her introduction, is a theme around worthiness and the franchise, and thinking that the challenge of elections in America today is one that admittedly gets framed as partisanship, and at the end we can talk about the shifting boundaries of partisanship measured by indicators of socioeconomic status. But in what strikes me is that party alignments have changed over time. Major parties in one generation have disappeared by another. Political alignments may change, but I would argue that the constant, or at least one of the constants in American political life, is the belief that worthiness informs how we should frame and name and, you know, distribute the franchise. So, in my effort to, let's see how technical we can be. I am going to share and start a little PowerPoint that I have put together. Um, and please, let's see. And I'm going to pause just a second to just make sure that what we're seeing is my title page with embedded in it a photo that is, fair use of Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act. Yes? Someone please
Yes.
say yes. Excellent. All right. So, what I want to talk about is the notion of the vicious voter and worthiness and the American democratic life. As I've said in my sort of introductory notes, the idea of worthiness, I think, is deeply embedded in American democratic life. And our structures around political participation and representation appear to me to be tied, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, to the notion of worthiness. And and even though I would say I want to look back historically, I can't help but think about both the 2024 election, where we have a president who, for in one of the rare moments in American history, but happening more frequently in the 21st century than prior, that the president is elected purely by virtue of the Electoral College. He did not have a clear majority, but nonetheless, I mean, in fairness, he won the plurality of the vote. And of course, in 2016, he did not win a majority at all. But, we have a president who wins by the certainty of the operation of the Electoral College, which in its own design was meant to prevent majoritarian rule. From an era where the founders distrusted political majorities and feared democracy when framed as sort of the will of the majority of the people. Their notion of majoritarianism in and of itself was one that gave expression to the majority of those who were, as I'm going to argue to you, worthy of exercising the franchise, right? And 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 in a way, the contrast of that is illustrated by the 2020 election, right? If we think about the 2020 election and the rampant amount of accusations of voter fraud, the evidence of which was non existent, that the courts unanimously defeated all of the claims of some form of election fraud that was designed to subvert the election. And if you count in the sort of score sheet of cases brought by the 2020 Trump for president campaign and its allies in various states, particularly states where um, Trump lost by the narrowest of margins, and the allegations were not necessarily that entire states had some legal defect in the way they counted votes or in the way that the election was administered, but specific cities who where the claim was that the way a particular city or a particular county, largely cities and counties with majorities that are people of color, you know, it was claimed without proof that these places were the avenues by which some sort of malfeasance happened, and therefore the election was problematic. If we stop and think about this for a second, and I wrote a paper um, on the 2020 election and this narrative, which I argued was racially coded, um, that it is this that sort of illustrates the kind of worthiness battles that I'm claiming are happening in our sort of political life today. But obviously, in this case, because there was no proof, um, the rule of law served to preserve the functioning despite the rhetoric and despite the sort of attacks and abuse that election workers and poll workers suffered, and so the ultimate attack on our democracy, where for a time, for a matter of hours, the Capitol had been stormed on January 6th, 2021, and members of law enforcement died in the course of protecting the democracy from this kind of mob rule that the founders feared nearly 250 years ago. I think that's ironic in and of itself. But my argument here is that there is an identity politics that is playing off or playing out in these electoral politics. And the evidence of this is in part what we have seen in the previous elections, but it's in part also the long arc of what we see in terms of what I think of as the access versus integrity debate, um, which is that there are two competing policies around voting rights, at least in terms of participation in election administration, where there are advocates on one side arguing for more access, but on the other side, buoyed by a myth of voter fraud and lack of election integrity, wanting more security to the process. And that these two sort of exist in tension. And we see the shifting of election rules more towards election integrity, more towards criminalization of the process, and the normalization of measures which, according to both our legal according to our legal measures as well as our popular measures, would have been considered suppressive or exclusive a generation or two ago. But if we look at generation or two further back, these ideologies were normal and they were spoken out loud because our beliefs in terms of who ought to be able to participate in the franchise ring remarkably similarly if we look at a century or 2 centuries back. But there is this tension because we have these underlying beliefs and yet we evolve our way of thinking. And so in the 21st century, there are folks who argue, on the one hand, that we need more universalism, but on the other hand, folks who argue that there's an excess of democracy, to name um, a phrase from the era of the founders, that the founders wanted to avoid excesses of democracy. So this brings me to this big idea that ultimately a narrative of worthiness continues to justify laws that needlessly exclude otherwise eligible voters from the franchise. At the heart of this dynamic is the persistence of the myth of a vicious voter that threatens the American political process. The myth holds that some voters are groups of voters by virtue of their status, their dangerousness, or their lack of competency pose a danger to the body politic. This myth dictates that those unworthy voters should be limited to lesser status in the political community to preserve the republic. Champions of exclusion have deployed this myth throughout American history to disenfranchise. So, in this sense, I believe that this is the dynamic that we see both today and throughout history. And my goal in the time I have is to exemplify this and to provide an account of it that may be persuasive and, given the work of Northeastern voter advocates, might also help to buoy and give, you know, hope to the kind of work that this group does, this very important work. And as Sid noted in the introduction, I've had the privilege to consult a little bit on this work in the name of realizing that it is this dynamic that, in a sense, is being fought, and that it is this dynamic that is sort of playing out in both the recent elections that we have seen and in the um, narratives around the law that are currently in place and are being deployed. But I hope to talk about this, within, the next half hour. So let's look at the 2020s, and I guess in fairness, we could say the last decade of our elections just a little bit more before we sort of drop back into the history of it, right? To sharpen the claim that I made earlier, um, Trump, from the beginning of his political life, deployed tropes around immigrants, around people of color within the United States, to both demean these groups and to signal to his likely voters that they should engage in the political process. And at the same time, both across the past decade of him being a player in major party politics, he disparaged practices like voting by mail and other attacks on the integrity of the political process in relation to his outcomes. Of course, when he won in 2016 through the Electoral College, but lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, he argued nonetheless that he was robbed a popular vote victory by illegal voters who somehow magically appeared and without detection interfered with the political process to the point that they tipped the popular vote to him. And on that basis, he sought to impugn, ironically, impugn the victory that he had gained. And of course, in Trump 1, we saw the creation of election integrity commissions, the Election Integrity Commission, whose goal, unlike other commissions set up by other presidents in recent memory, was not to improve the process, but to pursue voter impersonation, voter fraud, and other claims of voter fraud as a way of justifying Trump's claims that the election was infected by illegal voters and specious election administration. Of course, as we all remember, the Pence Kobach election commission fell apart because the vast majority of states refused to cooperate. Interestingly enough, there was an interest convergence of Democratic controlled states that refused to engage in the sort of voter fraud rhetoric, and Republican controlled states who, though they remained silent about his claims, nonetheless argued that, well, the data management and strategies that the Trump administration's commission was out to engage in essence, data mining to pursue proof of these invisible claims, you violated the norms and the rights of the voters who cast those votes. So without evidence, the commission collapsed. And certainly Chris Kobach, who is a frequent commenter on, on the election integrity side of the access integrity debate, suffered a major loss given the opportunity presented by the national stage to implement some of the major issues that he sought to implement when he was Secretary of State in Kansas, including proof of citizenship laws and things that we are a decade later in the middle of a debate around. But of course, the larger subtext here plays out, as I alluded to earlier, through the election of 2020, the litigation around that, the January 6th insurrection. But then, of course, in 2024, we need to put on the table the fact that Trump wins a plurality of the votes. The closeness of that margin to the majority is gray at best. But even if it is a bare majority, the ramifications of this are that the second Trump administration sees the executive order that seeks to abolish proof of citizenship laws, notwithstanding the fact that President Trump has no power to do this, and we can get into that in a little more detail in the Q&A if you like, as well as the pending SAVE Act, which seeks through congressional legislation, which is properly empowered to implement documentary proof of citizenship requirements, make more rigid the ability for one to change one's name for purposes of voting, and arguably implements the integrity agenda on the national level. Now, this is the end game of the larger legal debate about access versus integrity. If we think back 2 decades ago, in the middle of the 20 aughts, we saw a lot of the debate about voter identification laws, right? Thinking back to the prior commissions, the Carter Baker Commission, that came to bear under George W. Bush, yeah, softly anointed um, voter identification laws. And of course, over the course of the 2000 aughts, those laws were given constitutional imprimatur through the Supreme Court's ruling in Crawford versus Marion County, where interestingly enough, no majority as to an opinion, but 6 justices in 2 opinions, divided 3-3, found that voter identification laws survived a facial constitutional challenge. What is important to me for this theme of worthiness is the idea that the courts relied on Indiana's claim that protecting the integrity of the election from the, in essence, the perception of voter fraud, even though the evidence of voter fraud did not exist, was a sufficient justification to allow the government's interest in Crawford to outweigh the interest of the voters who claimed that a segment of the population in Indiana, and if we think nationally, somewhere near 10%, according to recent census data, do not have the identification in order to meet the requirements of a voter identification law. That notwithstanding that claimed harm, the claimed perception that there is, in essence, a voter fraud crisis that needs to be remedied was enough legal justification to pursue these laws. Of course, these laws not only are measured by the constitutional measure in Crawford, which looks to the 14th Amendment and its equal protection doctrine as justification, but also in terms of the laws that protect for protect minorities from discrimination. The primary example of that being the Voting Rights Act. And it's enough to say for our purposes here that against the modern backdrop, the Voting Rights Act served to protect by, first of all, guaranteeing that voters could bring a cause of action, right, to bring a lawsuit against any state that did something that served to discriminate against minorities, right? This was the promise made in the 15th Amendment in 1870, but not given authentic life until the passage of the Voting Rights Act 95 years later. But even there, the other important protection of the Voting Rights Act was that states with a history of discrimination in voting were regulated by the federal government to ensure that new voting rules that they passed would not make people of color worse off, right? The technical word for that is non-retrogression. And this was protected through Section 5 of the Act, which in plain English simply says that if there is a history of voting and the current, that if there is a history of discrimination in the administration of voting that served to discriminate, and there is lagging indicators that minorities cannot fully participate in the process, then jurisdictions that meet both of those criteria are put under the supervision of the US Department of Justice in regards to their voting laws. So if a state or some other political jurisdiction wanted to change a law, they would have to go through DOJ or a federal court to get that change approved if DOJ didn't approve. This pre-clearance regime was struck down in Shelby County v. Holder. There, the court said, Chief Justice Roberts writing for the court, that the South had sufficiently changed, and specifically Black participation in Alabama had sufficiently increased to demonstrate that the formula that Congress created and had last updated in the mid 1970s was antiquated in relation to the current state of politics. The legal principle to support that finding was one of equal dignity of the states, inasmuch as the Voting Rights Act made some states subject to federal government control in regards to voting policy, where other states were not. Now, note here dignity in a rhetorical sense as an adjective for worthiness, right? But it is the dignity of the states that via Shelby County took more constitutional import than a generation ago in cases like Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections, which struck down poll taxes in 1966, and even Reynolds v. Sims, which created the modern equal protection doctrine around gerrymandering, where the dignity of the voter, at least in my conception of all this, was paramount. We now in 2013 see the dignity of the states as paramount. And of course, as we all know, the floodgates open after Shelby County v. Holder with the states that were, limited by the Section 5 balance between the federal government and those states did not have that constraint anymore. And so we saw litigation afterwards in places like North Carolina and Texas around racial redistricting and around voter identification laws, all around the theme of racial subordination and whether it's present in this post-Shelby County world. Now, in fairness, Chief Justice Roberts said that racism had not ended, but his rendering of history would suggest that racism had ended enough. A reading that my friend and scholar Cedric Powell argued was sort of a infiltration of what he likens to a post-racialist formalism, in the opinion that created the rhetoric to justify removing these controls and the actors there return to form under this guise of protecting the integrity of elections, which hopefully by this point the theme is clear that the politics of worthiness is playing out in this. Now, what do I mean by the politics of worthiness? I argue that under all of this is a belief that inclusion into the political community must be measured on some measure of identity. Now, as I have illustrated in my account here, that at least in part focuses on race in Shelby County and the identity politics there, racial identity politics seem to be the most obvious choice. And I would assert here that it is interesting to see in modern Voting Rights Act litigation, in the cases that are currently before the court and are likely to soon come before the court, a reconfiguration of how we measure race, right? The Louisiana case that is going to be re-argued next month. The call of this re-argument is the validity of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act's Jingles test that expressly looks at the history of racial harm, whether a racial group has the ability to see its wishes played out, if that group is big enough and could potentially carry out its intent in a fairly drawn district. So by erasing that measure potentially, by possibly declaring it unconstitutional, we would see a wholesale revision in terms of how to think about race and the politics of worthiness. By erasing race in a way that would allow political majorities to do what they wish without any regard to the minority. We could also arguably see this in the redistricting context in terms of partisan gerrymandering, right? If we think about the effect of Ruccio versus Common Cause, which took the federal courts out of the business of addressing partisan gerrymandering, one could make a similar claim. The easiest type of this claim would be the fact that, especially in places like North Carolina and Texas and in the Deep South, it is still the case that race and partisanship heavily correlate. People of African descent tend to vote Democratic. Now, that number doesn't necessarily hold true for Latinos, or hold as true outside of the Deep South, but we can see how partisanship often can be used as a proxy for race. And scholars like Rick Hazen, and myself for that matter, have written about this sort of race or party dilemma. But if we take away the party measures of gerrymandering and the racial measures of gerrymandering, then what is there left to do except allow for, in essence, unchecked majoritarianism? And mindful of the group I'm talking to, I'm sure at this point you're thinking, what about Ohio? Well, given the politics that we've seen around gerrymandering, and of course, the commission that was created in order to control partisan gerrymandering, which has been then sued over the last decade 7 times and lost 7 times before the Ohio Supreme Court, still nonetheless creates districts which, by scholarly measures, are still tilted towards an advantage for Republicans that outstrips the rate for whom Republicans vote. So unchecked partisanship, unchecked majoritarianism, in this sense, may also represent a dynamic of worthiness, a worthiness based on partisan identity and the desire to entrench partisan advantages. Now, I think I've obviously laid out the third point here that voter fraud, disinformation, and election denialism are the latest manifestations of this. I mean, suffice it to say, however, that this is a continuing story, right? I haven't talked about racial the election denialism specifically, but it is the subtext of both 2020 and 2024. Maybe less so in 2024 because Trump won, but nonetheless, the belief that these extreme measures like abolishing mail in voting and needing to raise stricter standards on the belief that there is this persistent problem seem to represent the underlying voter fraud ideology that is now manifest in the sort of election denialism and the ongoing repetition of the stolen 2020 election. And it would be interesting to see in the post Trump era how this evolves further. Now, the middle point is a point I want to emphasize in particular, and I'm going to change slides here. In as much as this distortion happens, it happens in a cyclical manner. If we think about history, and I've turned my whole presentation upside down because I saved the history for this part. If we think about history, the question becomes democracy distortion happens in waves. The waves come about in the name of coded ideological persuasion that represents to us some threat, and that there then comes a political shift based on the threat that would suggest that we need to have what I'm calling an invention of a class of vicious voters who represent and embody the threat, and that this threat destabilize the electoral system and thus legitimizes the exclusion of those voters deemed vicious in some sense. But of course, over time, our definitions of equality evolve, our ideas of who ought to be part of the political community evolve, and we see spurred by that intervention and resistance of a movement towards exclusion to the point where we affirm inclusion. Now, think again about what I alluded to regarding the Voting Rights Act and the long evolution of American democracy in that regard. Now, if we go way, way back, we can start with even with prior to the founding of the Republic and thinking about these cycles, right? The founding of the Republic saw an electorate that was driven by an idea of worthiness that rooted itself in property ownership and racial status. Property ownership, in as much as the original election qualification was the ability to own property and manage it appropriately. And those who were able to own such property were largely, though not entirely, white men. Indeed, women in most states were excluded by virtue of the fact that they were unable to own property. And even though there were free people of color in northern states who had the ability to own property, the balance struck by the fugitive slave doctrines embedded in the original Constitution and that grew into force, ultimately resulting in the decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, stymied the ability for even free people of color to participate. And then, of course, slavery commoditized enslaved people and created a political economy that was traded on how they those people bolstered representation by being counted as three-fifths of a person, but had no right to vote. But even against those norms, we saw evolution that resulted in by the turn by the time of the Civil War, universal white male suffrage, right? We saw a tension between Jeffersonian democracy and its focus on the leadership of the greatest of ability as chosen by the people, as opposed to the rise of Jacksonian democracy in the 18 teens and 20s, giving greater rights for the common man, and the resistance of the aristocratic attitudes that Jeffersonian democracy was based on. And so equality seeps into this discourse as among white men. And so over the first half of the 19th century, you saw the rescission of property requirements in exchange ultimately for poll taxes in some states and just plain registration of men universally in other states. But of course, as I've said, women, racial minorities, and I should also mention indigenous persons were all explicitly excluded by this time. But then, even by the time of the Civil War, we see the discourse arise again, even though we have the Reconstruction Amendments put into place. We see the long narrative of a nominal universal male suffrage in the face of the 15th Amendment in 1870, a decade of interracial democracy for men able to vote and representation created in that regard between 1866 and 1877. But then after 1877, the so-called redemption and the coming of Jim Crow virtually all but abolished African American votes from the franchise. But then that cycle replays itself through the long arc of the civil rights movement, which began in the face of decisions like Giles versus Harris, excuse me, Jackson W. Giles versus Harris, the administrator of the Alabama elections in 1903, where the Supreme Court signaled that it would give full deference to Alabama in its administration of elections and basically created a laughable excuse to simply ignore what the 15th Amendment dictated. But that same decade, the NAACP was formed. And decades later, we saw advocacy for universalization of voting through abolishing the poll tax, litigation that sought, proper administration of elections. And in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the voting rights being placed at the center, which bring us all the way back to that picture of the very beginning of Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 with Martin Luther King Jr. looking over his shoulder. But my argument about worthiness isn't simply tied to race, even though ironically, the mechanisms that lie in the patterns established by poll taxes and literacy tests and unfettered discretion of registrars play out today, arguably, in voter identification laws and the deference accorded to state voter administration as represented by Shelby County and Ruccio and cases like Bernovich and potentially the case we see coming out of Louisiana that will be argued this term. But it's worth noting that this rhetoric of worthiness extends to various groups that have been subordinated. So let's take apart the rhetoric of making the vicious voter briefly. So in starting this project, I imagined this as a meditation on viciousness. I often call this the rhetoric of voter suppression and focusing on the word vicious. So if you do the deep dive that I did into the Oxford English Dictionary, you realize that over time, viciousness, which we think of as um, anger and ferocity, actually has several classic meanings. And the three are here. But I think the three of these rhetorical forms also capture the kinds of discrimination that we often see in regards to voting. So one form is unworthiness. Viciousness was a synonym for not having the merit to exercise participation in the political community. So, we see that despite people meeting the definition of citizen, which in and of itself is a term that merits unpacking, that people were excluded on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of indigeneity throughout history. And as I have suggested, such ideology of exclusion leaves at least racial minorities and indigenous minorities open to voter suppression, especially in the post-Shelby County, post-Ruccio world that I described earlier. And arguably even the post-Section 2 world that may come to pass this term. But this also can be represented by requiring educational attainment. So literacy tests were a classic example. And even though literacy tests were abolished by the Voting Rights Act, and there is no serious threat to literacy tests today, that nonetheless, legislation that purports to say require English to be the official language of a state or of the United States may dispossess the right to vote from people for whom English is not their primary language or who may not speak English at all. We can also think of this in terms of the rootedness to it, as Sid and I argued, and I should say Sid argued and I consulted in thinking about homelessness as an arguable measure of worthiness, right? Part of Sid and my conversations that ended up in the report were informed by observations of how our election system is rooted to residency, right? That we presume to the point of assuming that someone must demonstrate an address in regards to where they live as an entryway for voting. And so for the homeless, this obviously poses a problem that we lay out in that report. But for this purpose, this is a conversation about Worthiness as illustrated as being housed and thus being open to purges. And indeed, the notion of purges in and of themselves represent this issue of unworthiness. And so there is one aspect of this. Another is incapacity, that there is a perceived limitation that one suffers, and based on that limitation, one ought not to be able to participate, right? I mean, if we think historically, both race and gender were treated as incapacity in some regards. And of course, those explicit definitions were erased over time. But arguably today, when it comes to physical disability, there are still substantial barriers. And my friends who write at the intersection of disability and democracy, such as Catherine McFarland at Syracuse and Rabia Belt at Stanford, would point out how our discourse around democratic participation is diminished by the failure to capture disability as this sort of manifestation of incapacity. And then, of course, the third sort of definition is malevolence or illegitimacy, right? That people who do not have moral standing to be part of the political community are worthy of not only of being excluded, but being excluded aggressively via an attack, right? The best example of this is felon disenfranchisement laws, right? And if we think over the arc of history, felon disenfranchisement transformed the disability that slavery rendered, right? If you're property by the reasoning of Dred Scott, you cannot participate in the political community. That then transforms into creating traps based on status in order to attack and make illegitimate people who otherwise would be legitimate. So we see the use of the black codes during the Jim Crow era to criminalize status and minor property crimes and to make people felons. And under the terms of the Reconstruction Amendments, disenfranchisement is allowed, according to the Supreme Court in Richardson v. Ramirez, as interpreted by Justice Rehnquist. Disenfranchisement is allowed for on the basis of crime. And thus, once one is a criminal, one has tremendous barriers in order to accomplish the ability to vote. Now, of course, we've seen, and this also illustrates our cycle again, a you, you know a an attack on these barriers. Virtually every state now has abolished permanent felon disenfranchisement, but states like Florida nonetheless uh, create documentary and pecuniary barriers to disenfranchisement. In other words, requiring the payment of fees, fines, and restitution before one can be reenfranchised, which I have argued in pleadings amounts to the reemergence of a poll tax. And so we can wonder again whether that illegitimacy card nonetheless persists in our modern laws. Two other points to be made here. One, we see the criminalization of voter participation laws on the rise, right? We can think that in Florida and Texas and other states, either the Attorney General's office has created units designed to prosecute voter frauds, the passage of laws that make what would ordinarily be administrative errors turn into per, um, felony level offenses. So if, say, a person who has their voting rights restored or is in process of doing that registers before restoration has been completed, in some states like North Carolina, and I'm thinking specifically of a story in North Carolina, that person would be prosecuted as a felon and then would have to, in essence, start all over again after jail time. And so the creation of, voter fraud police, if you will, the criminalization of things which ordinarily were treated as administrative issues, this represents a new sort of malevolence. And the last point to make on this is the extrajudicial self-help in this regards. I'll tell a brief story. I was retained as an expert in Colorado because um, election deniers were going door to door and taking, in essence, do it yourself polling of who residents voted for. According to the allegations, they focused on minority communities. Some of these people were carrying weapons or using badges that made them appear to be um, election officials, or they were understood to be such. And so the Colorado area NAACP brought a suit against the group in order to prevent this practice. The suit was ultimately dismissed for want of proof, i.e., there weren't witnesses to substantiate the claims against the defendants. But in my mind, this illustrates the 21st century version of how the myth of voter fraud and the framing of a vicious voter would leave open the suggestion that people might resort to self-help in terms of protecting the franchise. And this has a deep, dark history, right? If we think about Reconstruction and the Colfax Massacre, the Wilmington Race Riot, a number of the race riots that we saw during the Jim Crow period, many of these were buoyed by fears of Black economic and political power. And even after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which I would argue was the actual creation of an America that could be called a democracy, and that it was a herring vote democracy prior to the 1965, that even after 1965, we saw many lawsuits around the use of police to enforce election integrity measures and the use of voter intimidation by people sitting at polls. And we have seen this in recent elections with guns, people claiming to be there in order to protect the franchise. So open violence, the ultimate form of malevolence, right? Anger and mean-spiritedness. Now, I have gone on longer than I promised, but I want to leave with a final thought. Often when I give these talks, the very first question is, Professor, you've given us an hour of bad news. Where is the hope? Well, I think the hope is in rethinking American democracy and rethinking our values by naming and acting in accordance with this problem of worthiness in the franchise. Now, three quick thoughts. One, we first of all have to devalorize American hagiography. We like to tell our stories of democratic progress. And certainly, even the histories written by people like my own teacher, Alex Kaser, reveal the facts of the push towards universalism. But legal push towards universalism does not mean that we're a true democracy. One, as I've illustrated throughout this talk, the the formal the formal and legalistic gains are contingent, right? As I've said, the Voting Rights Act may see its greatest reversal since Shelby County this term. Our belief that we are a democracy becomes the first enemy. And it's easy to buy in that belief if we simply look at ourselves rather than looking at those on the margins. And that requires us to then think about our politics of worthiness, to measure things not by what people like me who easily can get an identification card, who can get through the hoops of proving my citizenship, proving my identity, and going to vote. Not by me, but by those who have the greatest problems, and creating a system that represents them. Now, as I have laid out the law here and laid out the big ideas, that requires a big reconceptualization. That requires us to think, what does representation mean? To even think that the ability to participate should be measured, to use the rhetoric often quoted from the Bible, right? To measure it by the least of these, right? The least able to participate, to ensure that all can fairly participate. And maybe even in the big picture of measuring democracy in terms of districting, because I have alluded to gerrymandering quite a bit, thinking that districts ought to be proportionate to the popular political will in a true sense, rather than driven by districts gamed for partisan advantage, right? That a conversation about proportional representation might be a first step to reconceptualizing what representation means. The hope I offer is that this is within our grasp. It's hard, but we come together in an organization like these because the hard things are worth doing in order to truly enable a meaning for democracy that doesn't rely on tropes, that doesn't rely on worthiness, but that is authentically composed of we, the people. And with that, I will put up the last slide. You can see my work on my website, atibaellis.com, and you can follow me on social media on Blue Sky. So thank you for hanging out with me for this hour and listening to my thoughts. And we can have some time for conversation.
Hey, great. Jacob, did you want to take it away with the Q&A?
Sure. If anybody has any questions, they're welcome to put it in the chat. I haven't seen any come through quite yet. But I know one thought that I had, um, listening to all of this is the importance of getting back to local. And I've been very focused on local elections, being that that's what we're working on right now, and how to have a better democracy, having representatives more closely knit to who we are. And I've been hearing from one of the pundits I like to listen to, Chuck Todd, talk about the possibility of expanding the House of Representatives. so that one representative is representing a huge number of people. And that way they would be mostly represented of their local contingency um, or constituency. But I just wondered what your
So I don't know if I've frozen or
I think Jacob froze,
okay,
honestly.
that's fine. So the sense of the question is
sorry. Sorry, I know I cut out there for a minute. I'm not sure where I fell off, but
no,
hopefully I think
well,
you got the point.
I think I did, and I'll try to briefly restate the question and answer it. Um, the concern, the possibility, right, according to Todd and others, and 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 I see great promise in this argument that bringing democracy back to the local level, bringing it to a level where, in a way, the notion of expanding the House of Representatives is another sort of lever on representation, right? We have 435 members of the House, you know, created in an era that is not today. In fact, it makes me think I should go back and look up when the number of representatives of the House was most recently set. But I mean, for our purposes, it means that each representative roughly represents about 650, 700,000 people or somewhere thereabouts. Um, if we're talking near 750,000 people, there is little access that such a representative would have to their local constituency. And that raises the problem of whether they would truly be accountable. And we've not talked about campaign finance any, but I think that this is an avenue where, given the diffuseness of one's constituency, where the political will is boiled down to polling bromides, the discourse becomes not what do my constituents want, but can I persuade my constituents to vote for me? And can I structure the district in order to ensure that they would vote for me and my party, right? If the ratio of representative to district were a lot smaller, that would mean the House of Representatives would be a lot bigger, but each representative would be more directly responsive, right? So instead of the enormity of this political district, let's say it were just the city of Cleveland, for example. you know and I think that there is promise in terms of reducing the scale and rooting people more closely to home. um and certainly that would also scale down congressional elections. um and maybe the worry I would have is that, given this world where there are few constraints on spending, smaller elections mean that smaller amounts of money can influence an outcome. And so I would hope that there would be guardrails for, the proposition of scaling down, federal representation. But, it also ultimately means a reinvigorated role for political parties, for good or for ill. Because if we're trying to organize a House of Representatives that is in the thousands rather than 435, forming groups and alliances would be necessary. Now, that also means an opportunity, right? There's the opportunity that rather than party organizing interest, it would be organized maybe by common regional interest or common measures of political interest that aren't the two-party system that we recognize now, or it means that there could be more parties that would then force negotiating, right? There is a whole other talk to be done about the two-party duopoly and
Yeah.
how that both freezes elections and their outcomes and skews them in favor of one party or the other and prevents smaller parties from coming on to the scene. And given how the polling illustrates the dissatisfaction that the people have with the parties as presently representing Americans, particularly when it comes to Democrats, you know, there's a conversation to be had about that as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think, part of it is taking away the ability to gerrymander when your area is a lot smaller. You're making sure the people in that area, um, they're representing just that area, and it's harder to gerrymander when you're that tight knit. One of our other questions was on what's your opinion on the new research suggesting that low propensity voters are changing parties?
Right. So that alludes to the New York Times essay that spotlighted Nick Stephanopoulos' argument that basically the old rhetoric of voter suppression isn't working anymore because the belief was that low propensity voters, um, as represented by race and class status, who tended to vote Democrat are now voting Republican, and that it's the elites that are now tending to vote Democrat, where the common notion is they vote Republican. Now, admittedly, um, I only got a first read of this today, because Sid was kind enough to let me peek at some of the questions in advance. But I think that Stephanopoulos' description of the movement and arguably, he's describing a new political alignment, right? And that arguably an alignment on the scale of the alignment that we saw in the 60s and the 70s around um the fact that the Democratic Party became the party of civil rights, and there was a sort of white flight political realignment where these low status white voters tended to vote Republican. Now, I want to dig into it a little more because I'm not entirely convinced that Stephanopoulos has taken on race as a variable within all this. Um, he speaks to this sort of new kind of class driven politics, but it seems like turnout is more often motivated by racial coding. Um, and so I'm wondering, I don't know yet, but one of the questions I would bring to my own reading of his work would be whether that has been adequately taken into account. I mean, there is a certain amount of realignment among Black voters that is made, um, in the 2024 election, we saw movement that is basically on the scale of like depending on who you ask, somewhere between 7 to 10 point shift from Democrat to Republican in the most recent election. But on the other hand, that's more like a 93 to 85 point margin for Democrats in around African American, and mainly African American men as opposed to African American women. Um, the Latino vote is more complicated, and I would also wonder whether the modeling would take into account that um, the Latino vote coalesces more around nationalistic identity as opposed to the umbrella notion of Latino or Hispanic. Um, and I guess my final point is a historical one, which is that even though um, voting might, you know, majorities might shift in this regard, it seems that as recently as the Obama years, race may end up trumping other status denominators if race becomes more important. And given that the numbers in the next 20 years point to white people becoming a minority, I would wonder how this realignment might hold when we hit the point where the Hispanic and Latino vote and the African American vote and the Asian American vote end up being a majority. So I think it's a plausible thesis, but I suspect that there are complexities yet to be played out in order to test the thesis.
Yeah, I always think about like the intersectionality that people can't just be identified by their race, gender, socioeconomic status, any of that. They're very complex, and it's, we can't assume one way or the other based off of that. Anne, I liked your question. Are you unmuted now to be able to talk? I don't see the sign. You
Let's
are.
see.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. I think I submitted two. Which one are you talking about?
I was talking about the slide about the waves because I was thinking
Oh,
the same thing about
yeah, yeah,
how, hopefully we're coming to such the point again where things are getting so bad that we're ready to make a breaking point and come around.
right.
And
And I, taking off with your wave analogy, I was thinking maybe we're at the crest and it's about to slam down on the shore. But that just leads me to the question, why do you think, in light of all the attention that the anti-democracy focus, especially in the election areas, played out in the media, why do you think that these campaign efforts emphasizing pro-democracy are not resonating with voters? Is it just because of the price of eggs, or is it too abstract for voters?
I would like put it this way. My gut says that the abstraction is hard to get one's head around, right? That the explaining why we need an independent redistricting commission becomes a complicated argument when I think many voters are content to see themselves represented um in the status quo, right? So, you know, and in a way, it's it gets to this old saw that, you know, it's either easier to vote irrationally than rationally, right? Fear motivates more strongly than the sort of stable reason. Um, and I suspect too that ultimately the folks who find themselves deeply invested in the status quo are probably invested because they see their identities within it. And even if you break the kind of barriers of, oh, let me explain it, let me convince you that this is ultimately fair, we get so wedded to our sort of zero sum game reasoning that,
Mm.
you know, I think people often go, well, what do I lose because of this? And if I lose my representative in my district, it creates the cognitive dissonance of wanting to attack it. Um, so if you can get past apathy, you then have to get past fear.
Mm.
But that's just my thought.
Yeah. That I was thinking that the whole time about the way fear is being utilized to drive people to vote a certain way right now. And that fear could a lot of times, in my opinion, comes from ignorance and that lack of civility and recognizing that our fellow man has much more in common with us than not, and making it that us versus them just creates more of that fear and anger and hatred and vitriol in our system and society.
Mhm.
Sid asked a good question here, I think. You've talked a lot about the historical role of violence in voter suppression and intimidation. Um, what do you see as the greatest dangers for escalation in the near future, and how can voters and local organizations like us be prepared?
I think that there is so I want to say
The
this
tough
very
one.
what?
The tough
It's
question.
a tough question. And I want to be delicate in my answer. Um the most immediate threat will probably arise when the Trump presidency ends. Um Given the facts, it will either end upon the expiration of his term, or if the prognosticators are to be believed, at some point prior, given his age and infirmity. Um, and my worry is that that will create, if it ends prior to an election, it will create a vacuum in power. I am not necessarily convinced that JD Vance has the gravitas to maintain the Make America Great Again coalition. And it will, in essence, create a challenge in terms of holding all that together. And if there is resistance to this, absent a democratic transfer of power, which in my deeper fears, I'm sort of like, well, I hear myself going, Well, Ellis, you're begging the question of whether there's going to be a democratic transfer of power. Um, you know, to me, there is this problem of if people resist um a fair transfer, right? Because the question has been raised. Does the 24th Amendment and the, you know, apply? Trump's interpretation would say no. And by that I mean the limitation of 2 terms. I mean, that's more outside because personally I'm not sure Trump's constitution would hold up under a 3rd term if there was one to be given. But all of this is to say these are fault points of polarization, which I think could spark violence. How to be ready for it? I think that there is, first of all, protecting the integrity of the system, that we can do that while asking for the system to continue to be fair. Um, I think that that is one avenue. Um, not every loss or not every transition of power is somehow a threat to us and caused by them. You know, I think educating about how things work and making clear to folks that sometimes the process is the process. Setting the sort of extraordinary situation of the second Trump administration to one side, I think there is a more local and particularized threat that comes from the oftentimes necessary gap between voting and result, right? We are not the UK or Australia or France where the nation takes the time and creates the infrastructure to allow everyone to vote within one confined period, and also then ensures that the votes are counted and a result rendered quickly, right? A proportional representation structure that allows simplification of a national ballot would allow for that. We're not those places, right? And letting people know that the interstitial gap between voting and the certification of results is not per se a threat, and that people should not take up, if not arms, take up outrage and take up disparagement and feeding this cycle of ongoing political violence against election infrastructure, right? That is not an appropriate response given the reality. And organizations like this can invest in educating people about the reality of how one's vote gets translated into a result in order to allay those fears before they're giving purchase.
Yeah. I was thinking along the lines of that, of using the votes we have now to make sure the legislative people that we're electing sooner are going to be strong to be able to stand up to the power vacuum on the executive side. That we put in place the right, people that are going to have a backbone to be able to hold up the structures that we do have in place, because I do believe our system is good as long as the people we put into it can have the values to hold it to it
Right.
true.
And the like you said, the backbone, the will.
Mm-hmm.
Because one can preach values all day, but if one doesn't want to act on one's values, then
Right.
there's a problem. And I mean, it doesn't take much to reading of my work to know that I am pro voter and I deeply question, you know, the party system. And oftentimes I write with an edge of a pox upon both your houses. Um, but that said, you know, in this talk, I've kind of picked on Republicans in the modern iteration, but this gives me an opportunity to say Democrats had many a chance within the last decade to push forward reform, especially in those moments where Obama was president or Biden was president. Well, particularly when Obama was president and there was thin majorities in both houses, but there was resistance to accomplishing reform agendas. And now, for the past decade, the Democrats have been rendered to simply, you know, I love the ideas and the various iterations of the HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. But where there was a window in the past to deal with those issues, Democrats' support for that was less than fulsome, and we live in that space as a result. And not just the pro-democracy legislation. If I'm going on the record about this, you know, I think about the opportunity to future-proof Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat on the Supreme Court. Um, the opportunity around Merrick Garland's nomination were also missed opportunities to future-proof the democracy. And we are now where we are, and that contributes in its own way, you know. So
So let's find a way to come together as a community and get good people in office, get everybody voting now before their rights get taken away.
the most important election is the next one.
Always.
And ensuring that people believe that, and frankly, yeah, here's a preparation. I have said in the past that there is a sort of there is a line, right, throughout American history. The underlying franchise has served the function of defining the American Republic. And yes, I said earlier that it was a herring-vote democracy until 1965 because there wasn't full guarantee of minority participation. So it was the democracy for those who qualified, and those who were disqualified for specious reasons kind of cut against this. But the practice of voting and the fundamental rights contained therein has always been the thing that the United States has hung its hat on to distinguish itself from the rest of the world. And yes, I hear the concerns about, well, this could get taken away from us too. But we, the people in our voice, can voice our displeasure with that and resist such moves in a way that the same sort of energy and galvanization that happened during the civil rights era of the 50s and the 60s to shift the government despite its inclinations, could be brought to bear today if these sort of red lines get crossed. So Jamil Booley, the New York Times columnist, often talks about politics haven't ended. And there is still resistance to be had, and there is still force in this voice, right? And I'm buoyed on the Ohio level to think about how, yes, the gerrymandering amendments failed, but the reproductive rights amendment, and particularly the reconfiguring of um, the voting margins in order to address the initiative, failed, right? When it comes down to it, we, the people, have the voice, and we can sound off in ways that make the cost too high, that the demi-authoritarians cannot do what they would in their dreams wish to do. We all have that power, and we all need to be persuaded of that power, because ultimately the ideology of the demi-authoritarians would persuade us otherwise. But it's a truth that is the truth that they can't hide, and we need to remember that as we participate in democracy. And I think that's a good point on which to stop.
Right, that's what I was like saying. Yes, that's where my positive aspect I wanted to end on a little happier note. And with that, Meredith just put the link in the chat for our new website with the nice calendar for you to get out there and volunteer with us. For anybody that's able to do that, please volunteer, get out there, engage with the voters, talk to them about the importance of voting, just like Professor Ellis did for us here. Confront some of those um, myths about why their votes don't matter or why they can't vote. But engaging, motivating, educating the public to vote, I think, is super important, and especially in the next month leading up to uh, voter registration deadline, and then 2 months until the election. We get in that month of October, we'll be getting out the vote. But that first link is there, and then Sid added a link for donations. Meredith, I'll let you take over and talk a little bit about donations and our membership.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. This was very informative and inspiring. I wrote down the hard things are worth doing. That's what I'm gonna take from this. Yeah, so please, I think one thing you can do, yeah, definitely is to volunteer, right? And it can getting out there, talking to people, putting down our phones. Volunteering helps us too. It doesn't just help the other person, right? And then, we are looking for donations to have a strong program this fall with registration and with turnout, or get out the vote effort that will be gearing up in October. So please do donate. We also have a membership program. So that's for like essentially recurring donors. And you can get a t-shirt and get invited to talks like this too. So that information is also on our website.